Hey guys. This is part 5 of What If Naruto and Sasuke Became Friends a few years early. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 14. As Jiraiya stood over the faceless bodies of 3 grass genin, he couldn't quite help but feel an ominous sense of foreboding. Not because of the bodies, he'd seen hundreds, perhaps thousands of those in his day. No, it was because the way they'd been killed was awfully familiar. After his former teammate had ran away from the Leaf Village, Jiraiya himself had hunted the man for a year or two, trying his best to find his old friend. He'd ventured across the entire continent, through all 5 of the major nations, and found only hints of the man's presence. These corpses had been his calling card. One's missing their faces. And you're sure this is him? An Umbu he didn't know spoke beside him, tilting his head a bit curiously. About as sure as I can be. Jiraiya looked back towards the other ninja present, a woman who, to his immense joy, thought that fishnets counted as an actual outfit. You said it yourself, right? That mark of yours is acting up. The girl, Anko, as she had told him, nodded, trying to mask the expression on her face with her left hand. It didn't help all that much, her eyes still gave her away. She was afraid, and honestly, Jiraiya couldn't blame her. Orochimaru had that effect on people. But there was something else in her expression as well, a quiet anger played upon her features, and it sent a small chill down his spine. Going into a fight with those kinds of emotions weighing you down put you at an immense disadvantage. She couldn't be allowed to go alone, not if they wanted her to come back alive. I'll accompany you into the forest, then. Jiraiya spoke, walking towards the edge of the tree line and gazing in. He could make out nothing, though. That was, of course, the point of the place. You won't complain, will you? Anko seemed to ponder that. She clearly wasn't too thrilled about his idea. He imagined she wanted her first meeting with her old master in nearly a decade to be more personal, but clearly the rational part of her mind recognized it as the smarter suggestion, and so she nodded up at him a few seconds later, a grim determination set upon her face. Yeah, I'm... The woman sighed, before giving him what was possibly the weakest smile he'd ever seen. As ready as I'll ever be. Running wasn't going well. The 4 of them were galloping through the trees of the Forest of Death, raining weapons and jutsu behind them as they went, and yet no matter what they did, they could never quite manage to lose their assailant. The man was fierce in his attacks as well, and only through a combination of panic dodging and sheer luck had they managed to avoid being skewered or killed by any of his mass array of jutsu, one of which was a particularly nasty attack where he launched several snakes out of his sleeve. Sasuke couldn't quite focus on the man's attacks though, on account of the girl he was hauling along on his back, who had gone frighteningly still in the past few minutes. Sakura had taken a hit meant for him, pushing him out of the way of it, and completely foregoing her own safety. That damned idiot! Sasuke practically snarled, drawing a kunai out of his pouch with his left hand, and throwing it directly at their pursuer, who batted it away with the side of his hand, barely noticing it at all. Why the hell would she do something like that? Because she's your friend. A tiny voice in the back of his mind told him what he already knew. He knew that, of course. He knew why she'd done it. It didn't take a genius to understand. But that didn't mean he didn't want to yell at her, at himself, at the damned bastard who did it to her. Alright, so running's not working. Sasuke looked back towards the other girl with them, who was just now unleashing a few more weapons back at Orochimaru. Got any more brilliant ideas, whoever you are? Listen, kid! The girl called back to him, an annoyed expression set upon her features. I get you're worried about your friend, but there's no need to be an ass. Sasuke bit back the retort that came to the tip of his tongue. As it stands, running is working a hell of a lot more than fighting would. I was able to fight him earlier. Sasuke couldn't help but exclaim, rage once more bubbling up to the surface. And do you honestly think he was taking you seriously? The girl rounded on him, practically screaming. It hurt to admit to himself that no, the man hadn't been taking him at all seriously. Orochimaru had been toying with him. At any time back there, he could have been killed with barely a thought. Deep down, he'd already known that. There'd been something weird about their fight, how the man hadn't so much as drawn a weapon or gone so far as to cast a single jutsu. Alright, fine, I'll admit we can't fight him, but running like this isn't working. I've got an idea! Naruto shouted beside them, drawing a small object from his pouch and thrusting it into Sasuke's left hand. First of all, it's gonna need some setup time, and you've got better aim than me. Sasuke looked down at the item the boy had handed him and saw that it was their one and only flash bomb, an item Zabuza had given them as a sort of last resort. Alright, listen kids, the assassin had told them. Sometimes, shit just doesn't work out the way you think it will. Happens to the best of us. If you can't kill the problem, and you can't run from the problem, then you'd best use this to get the hell out of Dodge. He'd have to thank the man later. Sasuke lit the fuse on the bomb and threw it just ahead of them. The three of them jumped past the explosive just before it went off, letting off a blast of pure white light. They heard the man behind them let out a sudden cry, and it appeared that even the eyes of a legendary Sannin were still weak to being blinded, because the sounds of his pursuit faded. Let's go! Naruto called, a small, hopeful smile blooming on his face. We need to make some distance while we can. Right. The two of them sounded off. Nearly half an hour of running later, Naruto was finally feeling confident enough to let them all stop and rest for a moment. He was fairly sure they hadn't lost a man, not with how legendary Tenten had said he was, but this was about as good as it was going to get. Alright, he began as they formed a tight triangle, sitting back to back so as to always be watching for their pursuer. My idea is basically to make a crap load of shadow clones, transform them all into us, and send running in different directions. Tenten looked at him like he was crazy. Wait, you can do the shadow clone? Naruto felt like he'd never get tired of seeing the odd expression on people's faces when they said that, but now wasn't the time. Yeah, and I can do a pretty mean transform as well, so I think that's our way out. That's all well and good, Naruto. His friend spoke up, only taking his eyes off of Sakura's still form for a moment. But how do you know he won't be able to see through it? Naruto gave a small, panicked laugh. I honestly don't think it'll work, but it will buy us some space. Naruto looked around the forest, examining everything as he did a full sweep. At this point, our goal should be to get out of the forest and get help for Sakura as soon as we can. When it comes to this exam, I agree with you. Sasuke admitted, his hands balling into fists, his knuckles practically going white. We don't have a clue what's wrong with Sakura, and if her condition gets any worse, I don't know what we'd be able to do in a place like this. The problem, however, Tenten interjected, once more carving a design into the ground around her, and what Naruto realized was a nervous tick. Is that this place was designed to be confusing as all hell, even Jonin can have problems navigating it. How do you know if you're going towards the edge of the forest, or deeper in? To that, Naruto had no answer. It doesn't really matter actually. The both of them turned to look towards Sasuke. Really, we already know that there have to be teachers and examiners in the middle of forest, right? The Uchiha waited for them to both nod. At best, we end up at the edge of the forest, and we can make a getaway as soon as possible. At worst, we end up in where we're supposed to be without a second scroll, and explain that we'd like to withdraw from the exam. No, Tenten shook her head, expression grim. Worst is you accidentally take the longest possible route into the forest, come across a powerful trophy hunting team, and get yourselves killed by them instead. So what the hell would you have us do? Sasuke spoke with venom in his words, his eyes hard. Just sit around and wait for Orochimaru to kill us? I didn't say anything like that, did I? The girl argued, digging her kunai deep into the earth below her. I'm just saying that trying to escape from here and trying to head towards the center of the forest might as well be the same thing at the end of the day. You're going in blind either way. This time, it was Naruto who interrupted, with a confident, snarky laugh. Actually, we won't be going in blind. He stood up, and raising his hand into his telltale sign, spoke multi-shadow clone jutsu. He felt like he'd been punched in the gut as 100 or more Narutos popped up around him, and fell to his knees in exhaustion. Naruto! His friend reached over to help him up, but he held him off, getting a hold of himself a second later. I'm fine. He gave the boy his trademark smile, before looking over towards Tenten and giving her a thumbs up. So, Mr. Shadow Clone, the weapons user spoke up, as the clones began to change into multiple sets of the four of them. You said that we aren't going to be blind, why don't you explain for the class? Sasuke's eyes widened a second later, and a small smile bloomed onto his face. You get their memories too? Naruto's smile mirrored the other boys. Yep. I'll send them off in all directions, and not only will they act as decoys for us, but they'll also be scouting out the surrounding area. If they find the central tower, or the exit to the forest, they'll disperse and let me know. Well, color me impressed. Tenten gave him a pat on the back, standing up to match the rest of them, and pocketing her kunai. I honestly didn't think you had something like that in you. Naruto rubbed the back of his neck, feeling just a tad bit embarrassed, but couldn't help the small chuckle that bubbled up inside him. It's nice to be appreciated. Well, if I'm being honest? Naruto spoke, smiling sheepishly. I just thought of the memories thing a minute ago. Sasuke gave a small smile at that, shaking his head. You're allowed to not tell us these things, you know? Yeah, but where's the fun in that? You're insufferable. That's my best trait. Alright, you too, Tenten spoke up, putting a hand on both of their shoulders. Naruto, you ready to execute this plan? He gave a nervous smile, but felt his confidence rise the longer he looked at the friends in front of him. Sasuke, his best friend, who'd always watch his back. Tenten, a girl he'd only just met today, but one he got along with quite well, and Sakura, attacked and injured, who needed their help. Yeah, he gave the signal, and his clones charged off into the forest, all going different ways, taking different paths hopefully. One of them would find the route that led to their salvation. I'm as ready as I'll ever be. The four of them looked towards the only path that was left unclaimed and charged forwards. It took barely 30 seconds for Naruto to get some information back from his clones. Orochimaru's clothes, he exclaimed, doing his best not to raise his voice for fear that it would alert the man. How close? Tenten inquired. Judging by how long it took? Sasuke spoke up, looking rather grim. A minute out, at best. The three of them shared a quick look, trying their best to stay upbeat as they continued to jump from branch to branch. A minute or so later, another flash of information hit Naruto's brain, though this one was a bit better for his mood. He's further away. Naruto couldn't help but release the breath he'd been holding, breathing deeply for a second or two before continuing. He's probably 2 or 3 minutes out now. We should keep going this way, and only stop if we need to. Agreed, the both of them said. A groan cut through their new cheer like a knife, and they landed on the ground a moment later, all crowding around Sakura. Is she all right? Naruto couldn't help but ask. I have no idea, Sasuke admitted, reaching over to her neck to check her pulse. As far as I can tell, she's alive. Yeah, we can see that. Listen, I'm no medic, Naruto. His friend sighed out, before taking the girl on his shoulders once more, placing his hands underneath her thighs. Come on, we need to keep moving. If she wakes up, great, but we can't afford to stay still with that guy still on our tail. Naruto, did any more of your clones bite it? Tenten asked. No, they haven't, not since the last group. The girl shivered. That gives me a bad feeling. Doesn't everything? Sasuke spoke, a bit of rudeness making its way into his voice. While those two argued for a moment, Naruto took a second to examine their surroundings. They were in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by trees, but then again, that could have described half of this damn forest. A small hissing noise pulled him out of his thoughts a second later, and he looked down to see a small, pure white snake looking up at him from the forest floor. Naruto's eyes widened, and he felt his breathing cease. He reached down towards the snake, picked it up without any resistance, and held it towards his teammates. Guys! He shouted towards them, breaking them out of their argument. We have to go, now. The other two seemed to wonder what he was saying, but only for a second before they too seemed to realize. The reason why his clones had stopped being killed, the reason why Orochimaru had suddenly gone quiet. He'd found them. Tenten took the snake and threw it across the clearing, before grabbing her scroll and slinging it onto her back. Sasuke once more held Sakura, and the three of them dashed back into the trees. Naruto created a single shadow clone as they jumped forwards, sending it directly behind him. 20 seconds later, it sent back the information he'd been dreading. He's right behind us, Naruto shouted, knowing that it didn't matter if he raised his voice now, the man would have no problem finding them even if he stayed quiet. Holy shit. Tenten muttered under her breath, drawing a kunai out of her pack, with a small paper tag on the end of it, and throwing it into a tree behind her. If you guys have any more of those flash bombs from earlier, now would be the time. An explosion rocked the forest as the girl's paper bomb went off, though he had a sneaking suspicion that wouldn't be enough to kill their pursuer. We were only given the one, Sasuke admitted, grinding his teeth together. Tenten gave a small, annoyed tsk, before she reached into her bag and started tying a tag to another kunai. Naruto sent out another shadow clone, just to gauge their distance to Orochimaru. He waited 5 seconds, quietly praying that the man wasn't that close. 10 seconds. 15. 20. 30. Are we losing him? Things had not been going to plan, and that angered Orochimaru more than he thought it would. First it was that pink-haired girl, and then it was those damned kids managing to pull a fast one on him. As he carved his way through the forest, jumping straight through trees as thick as boulders with nary a care in the world, he couldn't help but quietly seethe. As an explosion rocked directly in front of him, likely a foolish attempt to delay him, he decided to simply ignore it, charging directly inside of it, taking the brunt of the force onto his arms, and coming out the other side completely unscathed. But charging straight through meant he nearly missed the 10 or so snakes that now charged out at him. He dodged under them, using his body's better-than-average flexibility to slink back to his full stature, and stopped just behind his opponent. When he saw who it was, he couldn't quite help the amused smile that blossomed onto his face. It's been some time, Anko. It has indeed. The girl, no woman, brought the snakes back into her sleeve, her eyes cold, filled with anger. My former master. He smirked maliciously. Looking at the girl's expression, he knew the battle was already decided. She would barely count as a distraction. He could deal with her at his leisure. Still, better to take advantage of her while he could. How have things been in the Leaf nowadays? He asked with a malicious expression, purposefully playing on the girl's already frayed expression. I've heard Lord Third is growing quite old. Have they finally decided to accept me as the next Hokage? A bubbly laugh echoed from above him, and Orochimaru's eyes widened as he just barely dodged a raging fireball, as it burned and coursed across the branch he'd just been stood upon. Like we'd ever take someone who's as much of an ass as you. A man who was practically a giant landed just next to his old student, though he recognized him without even needing to look. How could he not? He'd heard that damned voice practically every day of his life. Fancy meeting you here. He couldn't manage a fake smile, not with the anger that coursed through him. Jiraiya. His former teammate shot him a cocky smile that seemed to infuriate him all the more. What have you been up to, Oro? Still ruining people's lives? He didn't respond, didn't feel like bothering. The man in front of him was, perhaps, the only person on the whole planet who could still fight him 1-to-1. Well, that wasn't true. The Akatsuki had a few people he knew not to cross, but those weren't really people, not anymore. They were more forces of nature. The 6 faces of the man named Pain, the cold and silent Itachi, and the masked jester by the name of Tobi, who claimed to be of no note whatsoever. Orochimaru saw past that facade, however. The man practically leaked power, and seemed just a bit too good at being in the right place at the right time. But right now, they were of no consequence. The man standing before him, who had drawn the scroll that he had adorned across his back, and run his bloody thumb across it, was the only person that mattered. Summoning Jutsu. A massive billowing smoke seemed to engulf the whole forest, though Orochimaru already knew who the man had brought out. But it would have gone against his entire plan, everything he'd worked all these years for, to accept this duel, and so, while the smoke was still surrounding them all, preventing anyone from seeing anything, Orochimaru let himself sink into the wood below him. He melted into it, traveling along it as a snake, into the cracks and depths of the massive thing, and into the earth a while later. He disappeared, content to accept that he would be unable to mark the Uchiha for now. But he was not content to give the boy up either. He'd have that boy in his clutches. He'd have the Sharingan for himself. I can't believe I'm about to say this. Naruto spoke up about 30 minutes later, completely exhausted, but feeling oddly confident. But I think we lost him. They had stopped for a quick breather, but even now, Naruto's 5 or so shadow clones he'd sent to investigate kept reporting that there was nothing around them. For some reason, it seemed Orochimaru wasn't following them anymore. Sasuke deflated on the spot, exhausted from having to fight their pursuer, combined with running with Sakura on his back for over an hour. He set the girl down inside of a small hole in a nearby tree, and bracing himself up against the inside of the trunk, fell asleep almost instantly. Tenten gave him a sedated smile as she stood to walk towards the mouth of the entrance. I'll stand guard, since someone has to. The girl spoke, though she couldn't hold in the yawn she let out a second later. Nah. What, Ash? I'll stand guard. He smiled up at her, walking out to the mouth of the small cavern to meet her, putting his hand on her shoulder. You're tired, but well, I've got something that keeps me going longer than most people. Naruto, I don't care if you're hooked up to a damned battery. Tenten looked at him annoyedly, her eyes narrowed. No one can cast 100 clones, run for an hour, all the while being stressed out of their mind, and just be totally fine afterwards. He couldn't quite meet her eyes at that one. I'll stand guard, Naruto. Upon seeing his expression, she smiled at him. The nice thing about my techniques, is that they don't take very much chakra on my part. I just have to open up seals. I'm still pretty ready to go. He couldn't quite hide his own exhaustion, now that he'd stood still for a moment. His adrenaline was finally leaving him, and he felt like he would collapse if he stood for a second longer. If something happens, then I'll wake you all up. I promise. Naruto gave a contented hum at that, falling back against the bark behind him. It wasn't comfortable, far from it. It was actively uncomfortable. But it was better than nothing at all, he supposed, as he laid back against it and shut his eyes. He was asleep in barely a moment. Naruto! Sasuke! We've got company! Sasuke was awake instantly, drawing his pack onto his belt and stepping out of the cavern entrance, adrenaline already coursing through his veins as he stepped beside Tenten, who was looking into the forest with the bow staff drawn behind her. A second later, Naruto stood beside them, looking a bit tired, but no less prepared. In front of them stood 3 genin from the Sound Village, who he very vaguely recognized. So, you're Sasuke Uchiha, huh? The one who'd spoken was a boy with spiky black hair, and odd fixtures coming out of his hands. He seemed to be about their age, perhaps a year or 2 older, and he was smiling in a way that said he had all the confidence in the world. It seemed oddly fake. I am. He felt there was no point in trying to be coy, and with his Sharingan as strong as it was, he wasn't quite sure anyone could hit him. His teammates, however, weren't protected by his eyes, and so he knew what he'd have to do. He'd take the fire for all of them, in order to protect them. That was the only way. Great, that didn't take too long. The black-haired boy held his hands out, and Sasuke felt odd as the very air in front of them began to distort. Nothing personal, man, but we've got a job to do. A second later, a blast of slicing wind came straight at him, nearly destroying him where he stood. He was only saved by Naruto, who just managed to push them both out of the way as the wind sliced apart the tree behind them. He looked up and saw that Tenten had avoided the blast as well, though quite narrowly, it seemed, as she had a few new cuts on her left side. Seems your fancy eyes ain't gonna do you much good against the wind, are they? Sasuke gave an annoyed TSK but didn't say anything more. It was never a good idea to talk during a fight, despite what Naruto said about it. Oftentimes, when someone was trying to engage you in conversation, they were meaning to distract you, so you'd miss something else. Sasuke looked around for something, anything he might have been missing. The girl who'd been standing with them was gone. "I got her!" A voice called out from behind them, sounding awfully proud of itself. Sasuke turned to the side, so that he could see both the group of sound ninjas, and the other one, who was walking out of their small cave, dragging Sakura by her hair. He felt his annoyance with the circumstances explode, a seething rage burning within him, and he took a step towards the girl holding his teammate. "Let her go." The girl gave a cocky smile, holding a kunai to Sakura's neck as Naruto inched forward. No sudden movements. She smirked, eyes glowing with mirth. "Wouldn't want little Missy here to get hurt, would you?" He could feel it once more. The feeling he hated more than anything else in the world. "I'm powerless." His fists clenched until his knuckles were white, and he felt his eyes give off a dull ache. "Let her go." It was his final warning. He knew he wouldn't stop if that girl looked at him like that again, like she was above him. Like he was some little kid. He couldn't be held responsible. Forgetting about someone? He tried to turn in time to block the attack, but it was too late. A metal gauntlet struck his back with incredible force, and he felt the air leave his lungs as he fell forward. "Sasuke!" Naruto called out, swinging a kunai at the ninja before them, but he simply raised his gauntlet and poured some sort of force out of it. His friend fell backwards, his ears bleeding. He gritted his teeth and got back up, bringing out a shuriken into his left hand. "Just like I taught him." "I won't let you hurt my friends," Naruto called out, throwing the shuriken as he charged inwards. The teen with the bandages covering his face said nothing, merely batting the weapons out of the air, and answering the assault in kind, swinging his gauntlet again. It was stopped by a staff that swung up and into the ninja's face, knocking him backwards. "Sorry about that," Tenten spoke up, looking apologetic as she stood. "Long-range types are my worst matchup, so I've been having some trouble getting in." "No problem," Naruto called back, trying to size up the situation. "Enough sitting around." Sasuke rose slowly, taking deep, concentrated breaths to try and return his breathing back to normal. His back still ached, and he felt a bit of pressure on his ribs as he rose. He'd nearly forgotten in all the hustle, but he'd broken one on his left side. "You all seem to be getting rather uppity," the girl from earlier spoke, digging her kunai into Sakura's neck and drawing a drop of blood. "Would you mind setting your weapons aside?" Sasuke said nothing. Hell, none of them did. They were all too busy staring at the purple mist surrounding Sakura, emanating from her like a miasma. It swirled in a double helix, billowing out from a circle that had formed around her. What the hell?" The sound girl spoke, backing away from Sakura for a moment as her hostage fell to the floor. A second later, a design like a tattoo began to burn to life on his teammate's skin. It reminded Sasuke of a raging flame, seeming to consume the girl's flesh as it coursed across it. And then, as if nothing at all had happened, Sakura stood. Don't fuck with me!" the sound girl shouted, running at her with a kunai drawn, and 3 or so samban in her other hand, small bells tied to the ends of them. "Sakura, watch dash!" Sakura drew a kunai from her pouch, ducked underneath the girl's attack, and stabbed upwards. It was as if all sound in their tiny arena ceased. A moment later, the girl from the sound let out a small gasp and coughed up blood. What the hell?" The girl looked down, towards where Sakura's kunai was embedded in her chest. "Hey, Sasuke?" his teammate asked, looking over at him with deadened eyes. "Why are these guys attacking us?" He couldn't speak. He tried to, and then tried again, but he couldn't force words past his lips. They seemed to stick in his throat like glue, making it harder and harder to breathe. A second later, the girl drew the kunai out, and in one fell motion, plunged it into the sound ninja's shoulder. "Kin!" the boy with black hair called out, rushing over to help his teammate, but he stopped as Sakura held up her hand. "No. Stay there," she spoke, holding her kunai to the other girl's throat, looking horribly calm. I asked Sasuke a question, but he didn't seem to know the answer to it. His teammate looked down at the girl below her whose eyes were wide with terror. "Why are you attacking us?" she asked calmly. The girl on the floor said nothing, merely shaking her head as she tried to get his teammate off of her. She pushed on Sakura, flailing wildly with her hands as the pool of blood on her chest grew wider and wider. "We were ordered to," the same ninja from before, the one with spiky hair, spoke up. "We didn't." "Did I ask you?" Sakura spoke, looking the other ninja in the eye. The boy paled, saying nothing as he reached a hand towards his teammate. There was something wrong with the look in her eyes, Sasuke thought, as he watched his teammate turn back on the girl below her. She looked too calm, like she had no emotions to speak of. The abject terror of the girl below her seemed to make no difference. "We were ordered to," the girl, Kin, spoke a second later, her voice barely squeaking out. "Orochimaru told us to kill Sasuke Uchiha." "There, do you see?" Sakura said, smiling slightly. "Was that so hard?" "Sakura?" Naruto spoke, inching closer to their teammate, his hand outstretched. "Why don't you get off of her? I mean, I know they tried to hurt us, but—" "Get off of her? What?" The flaming marks seemed to crawl even further along her skin, down her left arm as she grabbed the sound ninja's hair, raising her head. These people keep attacking us, keep attacking Sasuke. Why? What did he, ever do to them?" She slammed Kin's head back into the dirt, and raised her kunai above her. "I'll stop them, I swear. I'm done standing behind you guys while you solve all the problems." Sakura plunged the kunai down. "I'll protect you." "No!" A blast of air knocked Sakura backwards, and the boy from earlier swooped down, grabbing his teammate in his arms. "Kin! Come on, I'll carry you, so you have to stay with me," the boy called out desperately, taking one of the girl's arms and slinging it around his shoulder. "We're not done!" Sakura called out, throwing her kunai at the two sound ninja. It was blocked by the gauntlet of the third, who stood between their teammate and his own. "We're falling back," he called out, taking something from his back pocket and throwing it at their group. As it landed in front of Sasuke, he realized with some shock that it was an earth scroll. "Consider this our fee for bothering you. You think that I'll let you leave?" Sakura charged forward, her teeth bared as she practically snarled, but was stopped by Naruto, who stood in front of her with his arms held at his sides. "Sakura, you've gotta stop, they're just out of my way." She wouldn't harm Naruto. Even now he knew it. But a part of him told him that the boy alone couldn't stop her, not how she was now. He shot forwards, wrapping his arms around her. "Please, Sakura, just stop," he whispered, his feelings a complete mess as he held the girl back. "Why?" the girl screamed, eyes wide with fury. "Why won't you let me end them? They'll only come back." There was a part of him, a pragmatic part, that agreed with her. These people would just keep coming back until either of them died. But there was another part of him that shouted, that screamed out, that this wasn't how it should be. He took Sakura's hand, the one brandishing the kunai, still pointed at her foes, and drew it into his own hands, gently cradling it. "You know, Sakura," he spoke quietly, noticing that Tenten had jumped up onto a nearby tree branch, likely watching the three others as they ran away, making sure they didn't try anything. "The two of us never once thought you were weak." The girl froze, but still didn't take her eyes off the forest in front of her. "You don't have to prove anything to us, okay?" He gave a watery smile, trying his best to keep composed. "So please don't dirty your hands for the two of us." The girl began to shake, her hand dropping the kunai, which fell to the floor, embedding itself in the dirt. "But I want to protect you guys too." The black flames began to subside, raging ever still as they were pulled back into the mark on her neck. "Then, how about we make a deal?" Sasuke offered, as the tears he'd been holding back finally flowed down his cheeks. "We'll all protect each other equally." Naruto smiled, turning towards where Tenten stood and walking over to her. I'll have to thank him later. The girl looked up at him with eyes that shone like emeralds. Are you sure? I'm not that strong. I'd trust you with my life, Sakura. He brought her into a hug, wrapping his arms around her back. You're the strongest person I know. Something within the girl seemed to break at that, for she let out a small, pitiful sob. She tried to hold it back in, tried desperately, but couldn't, and as the tears flowed freely down her face, she collapsed into his arms, crying loudly and messily into his shoulder. It's okay. He spoke quietly, mirroring what his own mother had once said to him whenever he cried. It'll all be okay. She sobbed even louder, openly, as she hugged him tightly. Maybe it wasn't the best thing for his broken ribs, as they seemed to crack and ache in his chest. And maybe it would have been a bit embarrassing to think about later, with Naruto and Tenten standing just a few feet from them. Maybe it was a bit too personal for people who were supposed to be just friends. But there was something within him that didn't much care about any of those things, and as the girl continued to cry, to let out all the pain she'd felt, Sasuke kept holding her. I want to hold on to her like this. As the minutes gradually ticked by, Sakura got quieter and quieter, until eventually he felt the girl in his arms fall asleep. Gently he rose, doing his best to try and carry her with him. He stumbled halfway, but Naruto caught him, helping him carry the girl back into the empty tree trunk they'd been in before. He set her down inside, and felt his own exhaustion take over. They'd only been able to sleep for 45 minutes after being chased by Orochimaru before the trio from the sound had attacked. He felt his eyes grow terribly heavy. Perhaps it was a moment of weakness, but he reached down and took Sakura's hand in his own. A part of him simply wanted to be near her, a part he couldn't quite explain. A minute or two later he was asleep, still clutching her hand, determined even then to never let her go. Chapter 15. Kabuto Yakushi idly turned his team's heaven and earth scrolls in his hands, trying to think up some way to pass the time. He was sat in a small, mossy indentation carved into a massive tree, one that created just large enough of a canopy of wood above him to prevent the pouring rain just beyond him from drenching his outfit. His teammates hadn't been so lucky, and they sat a few feet away from him, grumbling quietly as the downpour soaked their clothes. He had been told by Orochimaru to wait until the last day to make his way to the testing site, just in case he needed to intervene with anything in the forest, and even if he agreed with the plan, it didn't mean he was particularly happy with the details of it. They'd of course collected their scrolls as early as they could, snatching them from a couple of leaf genin who were insignificant, and then done their best to make their way to the central tower. But now they had nothing to do, other than to wait, and hope someone called them for something. Where are a couple trophy hunters when you need them? He could have done for the combat right about now, it would have at least given him something to do. A small hissing drew his attention, and he looked to the ground beside him, staring directly into the eyes of a pure white snake. Oh? He hadn't been expecting a message from his master, but the plan certainly accounted for it, and if he were being honest, it was at least something to do. And so he stood, walking just behind the creature as it slithered into the dark tree line beyond him. Where are you going, sir? Oh, right. He'd actually forgotten about his subordinates with the sudden summons. Orochimaru sent a message. I'll be taking it nearby, you two wait here. Yes, sir. They both nodded, going back to polishing their kunai, or checking their inventory, or whatever the hell else they thought they should do. Kabuto didn't particularly care about either of them. The plan accounted for both their survival and their deaths. They were very far from important. He walked perhaps 100 feet, far enough that whatever it was his master had to say, he wouldn't be overheard. When he felt the man's cold, oppressive presence, he turned to face it, undeterred. Master Orochimaru, Kabuto bowed slightly, before looking back up at the man with a small, almost malicious smile. What do you need of me? He didn't bother with idle pleasantries. He'd known Orochimaru more than long enough to know that the man didn't care for them in the slightest. He cared only for business. Kabuto could respect that in a way. The plan has changed. His master spoke, looking less than pleased by that fact. I was unable to place a curse mark on Sasuke Uchiha, and what's worse, Jiraiya is here. Now that was an unpleasant thought. Kabuto was strong, he knew that much. He was more powerful than many adult jonin, let alone most other 19-year-olds. But even he had no illusions as to where he'd stand against the Sannin. He'd come at Orochimaru with the intent to kill him, once. He'd been younger then, sure, and less experienced, but even still, the man had played with him, toyed with him, could have ended him on nothing more than a whim. Even now, Kabuto was fairly sure he still could have. And a man who could fight on Orochimaru's level, and according to his sources, largely go even with him? He'd be avoiding that confrontation, that was for sure. Is he shadowing that team? Kabuto asked, thinking that would be the only reason Orochimaru didn't try to place a curse mark on the young Uchiha a second time. I would imagine. The man admitted, stroking his chin with 2 fingers. It wouldn't be hard to figure out that I wanted something from that team, and even easier for a man of his caliber to completely hide his presence from children of that level. They'd likely never realize he was there. Unless he wanted them to. He brought up the obvious. Yes, I had thought about that. It is interesting that Jiraiya was called to the Leaf, far earlier than I was expecting. His master looked contemplative, but not overly worried. They had contingencies that accounted for hundreds of events, each of them with offshoots of their own. They'd been planning for this attack for a few years now. It wasn't hard to consider that they might just get unlucky. A sudden thought came to him, and his eyes widened as he considered it. Do you think he's watching the team because of us? Kabuto asked, a glint appearing in his eye as he looked towards his master. Or perhaps, he's watching them because of the 9 tails. Orochimaru seemed to ponder that for a moment, before looking back up at him with a malignant smile. A sound hypothesis. I thought that might be a possibility myself. The man's smile became almost cruel a second later, as he seemed to throw around 100,000 scenarios in his head. I have an idea, actually. Oh? The Sound Trio. I was originally going to use them to revive the Hokage, but I've come up with a different plan for them. Kabuto couldn't help but feel a bit confused. He didn't see those 3 as being worth much of anything, aside from the sacrificial pieces they'd been planned as. What would that be, sir? The plan is in its infancy at the moment, Orochimaru spoke, letting a snake fall out of his sleeve and slither away from them, into the heart of the forest. I'll tell you more when I can be sure it will work, but I've been seeing some odd behaviors from one of them, lately. And you think they're the key to getting the drop on Konoha? The drop on them? Orochimaru laughed, a sound that came out more as a rasping hiss. No, the opposite, actually. Kabuto's feelings must have shown on his face, because the eyes of the man in front of him practically danced with mirth. It's quite simple, actually. Orochimaru's face turned sinister, as the same snake he'd sent out came slithering back into their small clearing, winding up the man's leg and into his robe. I'm going to let them know we're coming. What? Kabuto couldn't help but raise his voice, though he cleared his throat, and corrected himself a second later. My apologies, sir. I just don't understand how that helps us. Oh, normally it wouldn't, I'll admit that. But what if information were to be leaked from our forces, and the Hokage, by some twist of fate, were to receive such information? Then, I imagine he would cancel the Chunin exams, sir. His master gave a cold laugh, looking back at him like one would a child. No, he wouldn't. You see, the Hokage is currently banking on one thought. Orochimaru looked back towards the forest as the snake from earlier hissed into his ear. Konohagakure can handle whatever it is I'm going to throw at it. Forgive me, sir, I still don't see how these things are related. Not a problem, Kabuto, I'm not asking you to think, merely to listen. Orochimaru turned back towards him. The old man has a fatal flaw, and it is that which will lead to his undoing. Kabuto couldn't quite help but swallow on nothing, looking up at his master with a genuine nervousness. It was born not of fear, but excitement. Orochimaru had never given information like this to him. What would that be, sir? His master bared his teeth, his lips drawing up into a horrid imitation of a smile. He is far too trusting. What am I doing? Zaku tried to ignore the pained whines that seemed to stream through the wad of cloth he'd stuck in his teammate's mouth, as he desperately stitched the girl's wounds together. He was no doctor, far from it, really, so his work was slow and tortuous, pulling needle and string through flesh with as much precision as his shaking hands could muster. Dosu, who stood a ways away, feigned standing guard, but was really trying his best to tune out the girl's screams. He couldn't blame the boy, he would have rather been anywhere but where he was right now. But one of them had to do this if Kin was going to survive. Even still, he couldn't quite bear to look at the girl's face now, not with how desperate and panicked she looked. It struck him like a knife every time a muffled scream tore through his makeshift gag, the one he'd put there to prevent her biting off her own tongue or breaking her teeth. That Sakura girl had done a number on her. The first stab had caught on the girl's ribs, which, while preventing the strike from piercing her organs, still broke 2 or 3 of them on her right side. The second strike pierced directly into muscle, and while she wouldn't be moving the arm for a while, it certainly wasn't going to kill her. The problem was that they were cut off from the rest of society in here, and even if they tried to make a break for it out of the forest, the girl would bleed to death. And then Orochimaru would kill him and Dosu for messing with his plans. And so, the only real option was to use the cursory knowledge of first aid that he'd picked up on the streets. You didn't get to see a doctor when you got hurt back where he was from. If you got a wound, it got infected. If you didn't know how to treat it, then the best you could do was pray you survived. Even still, the last time he'd had to patch his own wounds was 6 years ago, and even then, he'd been mediocre at best. But it seemed like, just this once, it would be enough. I've stemmed the worst of the bleeding, Zaku spoke, panting as he cut the string on the end of the needle with a kunai, tying it to another piece, and sealing the wound. She should recover, provided she doesn't have to agitate it anymore. Kin's breaths were gradually shortening below him, her chest rising less and less with each passing moment as the pain from his emergency procedure gradually began to fade. He reached over and drew the cloth out of her mouth, seeing that she looked far too tired to do it herself. How sure are you on that? Dosu spoke, looking back towards him with a doubtful expression. He shot his teammate a shaky expression. Honestly? Not very. A hand on his arm had him looking back towards Kin. The girl was barely conscious, extremely pale, and looking terrified. Hey, Zaku. Her voice came out in what might as well have been a whisper, and the hand gripping his arm seemed like it might fall at any moment. I'm not gonna die, am I? He felt something in his chest at that, like ice suddenly coursing through his veins. Why the hell do I care? And no, you're gonna be fine. Zaku spoke quietly, taking her hand in his as he sat beside her. Just get some rest for now, we'll move when you wake up. Okay, good. Kin gave a weak smile, like she was trying to assure herself more than anything. I wasn't ready to die, not yet. I can't die in a shitty place like this. The girl's head lulled to the side as she finally gave in, and Zaku waited until he could hear the sounds of rhythmic breathing before he got up, turning towards the other member of their team. We've got to watch her. He spoke, looking around, trying to find a spot where he could defend them easily. If one of those trophy hunting teams comes around, we have to be ready to pick him off, before. Why do you care, all of a sudden? The boy might as well have slapped him for how fast his voice cut off, and as he turned toward his masked teammate, he couldn't quite manage to form a thought. He tried to find anything to say, but all he ended up with was a stunned what? It feels like recently you've been. I suppose weird is the best way to put it. Dosu walked towards him slowly. It wasn't particularly threatening by nature, but it still had all of the muscles in his body tensing. We might work together, but we aren't supposed to be close, Zaku. Think I don't know that? Zaku growled, trying to put up a front of strength as best he could. Then why'd you save her? Words, Zaku thought to himself, as he stumbled backwards. They're only words. And yet it felt as if he'd been pushed backwards yet again, forced to confront his own actions in so blunt a way that it left him reeling. Right now, our lives hang in the balance of this mission, his teammate spoke, a cold logic coursing through his voice. As she is now, Kin is only going to weigh us down, make finishing the mission that much harder. Dosu stared directly into his eyes, and it felt like the boy stared into his soul as well. We should kill her and move on, just the two of us. He felt a stabbing pain in the back of his head. A memory he'd long thought gone seemed to be dredged up to the surface, and just for a moment, he was 9 years old again. Hey, Zaku. Shut up. Just shut up. I'll get us out of this. Zaku. You have to go, Zaku. Shut up, damn it. Zaku, please. Go. He fell backwards, landing hard on his back. He tried to breathe in but found that he couldn't manage it, couldn't so much as move a muscle. Zaku? I asked Orochimaru to delete it. Why am I remembering it now? Zaku. He turned to look up at his teammate, and found he could finally breathe again. As he was gasping for air, he tried to remember what it was his teammate had said. To leave kin behind. The memory he'd lived through a moment ago was already fading. He remembered only that he did not want to remember it. The first thing he'd done after being taken in by Orochimaru was have it be erased. He could feel the abstract guilt, without any purpose, even now, but he didn't know what to do with it, who to blame. But somehow, through all of it, he still knew one thing. I won't leave kin behind. He breathed hard and heavy, taking deep breaths as he tried to regain his focus. If you want, you can go on ahead, but I'll be waiting here. Dosa seemed to consider him for a moment, his eyes flicking from Kin's sleeping form to his own, resting just a few feet from her. You got a crush on her or something? It was such a sudden comment that it nearly made him spurt out a denial immediately, but he knew that would only make things worse. He didn't have a crush on the girl, or at least he didn't think he did. His feelings were a bit more complicated than that. No, I don't. I just... He couldn't find a way to describe it, the feeling in his chest. It was a quiet, tiny resolve. It said that he wouldn't leave someone behind, never again. He didn't know who he'd left behind the first time, but he knew the memories he'd given up must have been the key. I guess. I don't really understand how I feel. He looked up a bit helplessly towards the boy standing above him, feeling just a bit nervous as to how he would act. That's... The boy cut off suddenly, his face going white. Yo, Dosu? It's good to see the three of you. A shrill, raspy voice echoed from behind him, and Zaku turned almost instantly, holding a kunai out towards it. Upon seeing who it was, he didn't lower the weapon. It's good to see you as well, Orochimaru, sir. Dosa bowed deeply. My Zaku, their master walked over to him, and with a small motion, knocked the kunai from his hand. It's not good to point weapons at your betters. He hadn't even realized he'd been holding it anymore, but he felt a strange sense of anger overtake him as the man walked over to Kin's still form, crouching down and putting his hand on her forehead. What are you doing? He spoke just a bit more aggressively than was probably safe, and he knew on instinct that those words may have outright killed him. Calm yourself, child, I'm merely inspecting her. He reached his hand down to the wound on her chest, and after a second, pushed down on it, eliciting a small whine out of Kin. It's not terribly deep, but she did break 3 ribs. He still had that same uncaring smirk on his face as he said that, and it irritated Zaku in a way he couldn't explain. As for this one, he poked and prodded at girl's shoulder, drawing out another groan from the girl. Several torn muscles, but you've done a decent job patching these as well. Orochimaru turned back towards him, a lazy smile set upon his face. You never told me you were a decent field medic. There was something about how the man was speaking, some lilt in his voice, that told Zaku something was terribly wrong. He also knew, however, that he couldn't do anything about it, and so chose to answer normally. It never came up, sir. He couldn't quite meet the man's eyes as he approached. I suppose it wouldn't, what with Kabuto handling any medical issues that came up. The man's smile sent a shiver down his spine, too friendly, too open. It wasn't like him at all. I'll be giving you all a new mission, since the circumstances surrounding the first have changed quite drastically. Orochimaru drew 2 scrolls from his back pocket, one heaven and another earth. I assume you surrendered your own scroll to Sasuke's team like I told you to? Of course, sir. Dosa nodded. Then you'll be taking these, They'll get you into the second stage of the exam. Make sure you arrive on the last day, just to ensure I haven't need of you to do something before then. I need 2 of you to enter into the next round after that, but other than that, what you do is up to you. Will do. His teammate spoke, and he nodded towards the man stood before them. Orochimaru smiled coyly, looking down towards where Kin was laid, breathing as soundly as she could. And what do you mean to do with this one? Before Dosa could speak, Zaku interjected. We're planning on carrying her into the second exam, sir. Even if she's unable to compete, she'll be looked at by the medical staff there. It was a long shot, really. Zaku knew that the man was far more likely to simply run the girl through now and be done with her than to allow them to risk the mission for her sake. But Zaku felt he owed the girl enough to try and keep her alive. Orochimaru ran 2 fingers along his chin, seemingly deep in thought. A second or 2 later he smiled, looking back up towards Zaku with a curious expression. And why would you go to such an effort? I don't suppose you've developed feelings for the girl? He looked down at the bark below him, unable to meet the snake's gaze. I don't exactly. A shrill laugh cut its way through his words, and he looked back up to see Orochimaru laughing cruelly, mouth open towards the tree line above them. You've no need to explain yourself to me, at least, not now. The man walked over to him, giving him a small pat on the shoulder. I was merely teasing you. Those words sounded foreign on the man's lips, and Zaku couldn't help but shake slightly as the man's footsteps echoed subtly on the bark below them, stepping around him and towards a lower branch. Oh, Zaku? He turned back around at the last moment. One more thing. What is it, sir? There was a flash, a snap, and a rush of pain like a geyser shooting straight up his wrist. He screamed loudly, falling to his knees a second later. He looked down at his right arm, finding his hand bent at an odd angle, his wrist obviously broken. You should know better than to point a weapon at your superior, Zaku. Orochimaru's smile looked more threatening than anything he'd ever seen in his life. It was a cold reminder that he could do nothing against the man's raw power. Someone could get hurt. A second later, the man was gone, having literally melted into the wood below them. He cradled his right arm, trying desperately to quell the intense pain that kept shooting through it every few seconds. Get up. He looked towards the voice to find Dosa standing in front of him, eyes hard as he stared down at him. I will in a second, man, I just... Get up. The boy kicked him to the ground, where he fell in a heap. He laid there for a moment, trying to figure out what he'd done to deserve this, where he'd gone wrong. He'd thought they were onto something for a second there, thought that, just maybe, the 3 of them could become more than acquaintances. You just had to open your mouth, didn't you? Dosa spoke vindicatively, fury playing across his face. You could have killed us all. I didn't think. That's right. His teammate roared, slamming his gauntlet into the tree beside him, sending wooden splinters flying all around them. You didn't think. You're lucky he just broke your wrist. When Orochimaru shows up, I deal with him. That's how we've always done it, so what the hell were you thinking when? He felt a flash of anger, and now he was the one rounding on the other boy, the pain in his arms serving only to amplify his anger. You wanted me to just sit there and let him dispose of Kin. If it was going to keep me alive, then yes. I would have. You're standing right fucking there, aren't you? Zaku felt righteous anger course through him. He knew he'd done the right thing. His teammate didn't get to act all high and mighty when it was him in the wrong. We made it, Kin's alive, you're alive, I'm alive. And now we have one teammate out of commission, and one teammate with a broken wrist. Realization finally dawned on him. Orochimaru had said it himself. He needs 2 of us to pass this exam, or else we have no value. Dosa pointed to himself with his thumb. I can make it just fine, and if you were in good condition then I'm sure you could have as well. Zaku stared blankly down at his broken right wrist, trying to move his fingers, and felt only pain. He already killed us, you damned idiot. Dosa pounded his gauntlet into the bark below him, over and over, digging into the wood. A few seconds later, he seemed too tired to continue, falling into a slouch. He just delayed the execution. Zaku opened his mouth, tried to force air past his throat. Tried to breathe, tried to speak. Nothing happened. He felt like, all this time with Orochimaru, he'd been locked in a pitch-black cage. He'd known only that he was trapped. But he had not been able to see if something was coming to attack him, knew that if something tried, then it would succeed with little effort. What resistance could a blind man offer? What the hell do we do? He spoke after what seemed like an eternity. We do what we can do. Dosa gestured towards Kin. We'll take her to the exam site, wait it out till the last day, and then head inside. If we're lucky, we get matched against some small fry in the fights, and we make it into the next round without any problems. Kin might not be able to wait until the last day. Zaku felt he had to say. I know, you idiot! Dosa practically seethed, massaging his temples. The problem is, we can't enter early, or else we just get killed by Orochimaru for breaking his orders. He helped get Kin onto his teammate's back. The boy put his hands underneath her thighs, and he drew her arms around his neck. It wouldn't hold her, but it would help her from swinging off as they dashed through the trees. As he let her go, he tried to ignore the pain in his wrist, which wasn't exactly easy, especially since it had begun to swell. So, what you're saying is that we're relying on Kin's wounds not getting infected in a sweaty, shitty ass jungle. Then we're relying on nobody attacking us during that time, so that we can conserve energy in case Orochimaru needs us. Then we're counting on getting easy fights during the second round, also that we can then invade and attack Konoha, in a mission that will most likely get us killed? Dosa's face looked grim as he turned to face him. Basically, yeah? Zaku let out a quiet laugh, doing his best to not panic. It wouldn't do to give up this early, though he had the sneaking suspicion that this was all already over. Alrighty then, partner. Zaku returned his teammate's grim expression, though did his very best to answer with a smile, at the very least. Shall we get going? Sakura awoke, with a start, nearly hitting her head on a small wooden knoll to her left. She took in her surroundings, seeing that she was in some kind of cavern that seemed to be carved into the base of a tree, though whether or not it was man-made, she couldn't tell. I guess I must have passed out. She remembered everything she'd done while under the influence of whatever it was, but it felt odd. It was like a hazy veil had settled on top of her memories. She could experience them, but as if she was doing it through someone else's body. As she tried to move, she felt an oddly warm presence on her right, and turned to see that Sasuke had fallen asleep just beside her, his hand still in hers. A few years ago, she was fairly sure she would have simply passed out once again in a state of euphoric bliss, but she had matured, grown since then. Now her nose just bled for a while. It was no big deal. With some regret, she untangled herself from Sasuke, standing up and stretching, and walked to the mouth of the cave. She had seen Naruto as well, curled up in a ball in the far right of the place, but she had a vague memory of one other person fighting alongside them, and if she were right. Hey, you're awake? There you are. The girl before her, Tenten, if her memories could be believed, had taken to changing her outfit since yesterday's struggle. She wore the same pink tank top as before, although it was obviously a second outfit, for it bore no wrinkles to speak of, but she had taken to cutting her baggy pants at the knee, creating makeshift shorts, which Sakura imagined would be much easier to fight in should the occasion arise. It would probably also serve to be far more comfortable in the wet heat of the forest. Hey, I don't believe we've been introduced. Sakura laughed, feeling a bit silly as she reached her hand out towards the other girl. Sakura Haruno. Tenten. The other girl brought her hand up as well, and they shook a second later. What's your last name? Tenten merely smiled. Just Tenten. But surely you must. Just Tenten. Look then. Just Tenten. Sorry about that, I. The girl turned the kunai in her hand idly, then, placing it around her finger, began to spin it. My dad left me and my mom a long time ago, so even if I have his last name, I don't really. Sakura couldn't pretend to understand that, given that her parents were still together, but she felt she could at least get the sentiment behind it. She smiled up at the girl a second later, trying to show she meant no offense. My bad, I didn't mean to be rude or anything. Oh, don't kid yourself. Tenten smiled at her, eyes glinting with a touch of mirth. Asking someone their last name is an entirely normal question. I'm not going to be offended by it. Sakura rose her hands in mock surrender. I'm just trying to avoid hurting anyone's feelings. A second or so later, she let her hands fall to her back and drew out a small flask that she had in her tool bag, taking a decently sized swig. The cool water did wonders for her sore throat, and she realized with a start that she likely hadn't had anything to drink for more than a day. Fair, fair. The girl beside her rocked back and forth, her legs swinging to a beat all her own. So, you seem less murdery than yesterday. Sakura couldn't help but cough as she took some water down the wrong pipe, punching her own chest to try and settle herself. I really didn't think you'd say that. I've always been a fan of just coming out and saying what I think. Tenten smiled over at her. It has its ups and downs. I can see that, yeah? There was a momentary pause as Sakura tried to figure out how to explain what happened. She knew it probably had something to do with the mark that now adorned her neck, but other than that, she hadn't a clue. After explaining that to the girls sat beside her, she tried her best to sit still as Tenten inspected the mark with her fingers, lightly prodding her neck every few seconds. Huh, that's weird. What's weird? Sakura asked, turning towards the girl. I'm trying to look at it. Tenten pushed her back to how she'd been sitting before. Just sit still for a moment. Sakura's displeasure must have been obvious, because the girl beside her let out a small snicker as she lightly rubbed the mark. And you don't feel any pain when I do this? None, it feels the same as when you rub my arm. So whatever it is, it's not touch activated. Tenten seemed to ponder something, and then, a second later, had a revelation. I'm just now realizing that I probably shouldn't mess with the crazy murder seal while standing next to you. Sakura couldn't help chuckle at that, trying to smother it into her hand. Well, thanks for the show of faith. Hey, you're super nice at all. The girl held her hands up in mock surrender, smiling playfully. But I don't think I want to meet the you I met yesterday again. Sakura felt a twinge of remorse course through her as she remembered the terrified face of that sound ninja. Even now, she could still hear the girl's whimpering sobs, still feel her struggling get weaker and weaker in her arms. Could still remember the girl's eyes widen, trying desperately to stop her as she herself brought a kunai down to end her life. If she ever met them again, she wasn't sure what she'd do or say, but she did know that she'd have to thank that one ninja, the guy who'd blasted her away. He'd spared her the immense grief that would have come had she killed that girl. She'd have to thank Naruto and Sasuke too. They'd held her back at the end. And then Sasuke had hugged her, and they'd held hands, and slept together, and Get a hold of yourself, Sakura, her inner self chided. We can't be swayed by the adorable face of sleeping Sasuke. She briefly thought back to a few minutes ago, when she'd awoken next to the boy, and remembered how his hair had been all messed up, flying out at odd angles, how his lips had been pursed so cutely, and how his hand had still been in hers, even while they'd slept, and his. Hey, Sakura? Huh! Her train of thought broken, she flailed around wildly, looking over at Tenten. What is it? I didn't say anything. The girl winced, instead pointing over shoulder with her thumb, gesturing just behind her, where the two boys of their group, Sasuke and Naruto, stood. Hey, Sakura! Naruto called out, waving to her with far more energy than she felt it was fair for him to have. Morning, Naruto. She nodded towards him, and then shifted her gaze towards the other boy standing there. Sasuke. Hey, Sakura. The boy couldn't quite meet her eyes, his own face a bit dusty pink from embarrassment. What's wrong, Sasuke? She kind of hoped it was that the sight of her sent shivers down his spine, but decided against verbalizing that. And nothing, I'm going to, help Naruto watch the camp. Sasuke gestured wildly, trying desperately to find a reason to leave. A second later, he followed an extremely amused Naruto over to the trees just beyond them, where the two of them talked loudly. What was that all about? Sakura couldn't help but wonder, as she looked over to her companion, and saw that the girl's cheeks were blazing as well. Is something wrong? And nothing, it's just. Tenten drew in a breath, and then, seeming determined, looked her directly in the eye. Do you remember when you were thinking about Sasuke a bit ago, and you were saying all those things about how cute he was, and how his lips were like, nice and stuff? Well, yeah, I remember, but how did you? The entirety of the universe could have ended at that very moment, and it still would have been the second worst thing to happen to her that day. I said all of that out loud, didn't I? The girl in front of her cringed violently, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else but there. Why, yeah. Sasuke was right behind us when I said it, wasn't he? The girl beside her put a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. Hey, Tenten? Yeah? Sakura reached into her pouch and drew a kunai from out of it. Just do me a favor and kill me right here. Chapter 16. And you're absolutely sure you don't want both? Tenten sighed dramatically, trying her best not to run her hand down her face as she stared blankly into Naruto's sheepish face. I am absolutely sure that I don't need both of your scrolls, honestly. I don't even need the one. Well, either do we. Sasuke held up his team's own Earth scroll. We've already got one of our own, no need to have two, is there? Besides, you said your team had a Heaven scroll to start, right? Yeah, I suppose I did. She conceded the point, waving her hand lazily into the air. She had to admit that she quite liked Team 7, but they were all annoying in their own way. Fine, I'll take your extra scroll, happy? Yep. Naruto exclaimed with a radiant smile. She noticed Sakura giggle quietly, trying to hide it behind her hand. There's no winning an argument with him, unfortunately. The girl's smile became slightly forced. Believe me, I've tried. Tenten gave a small chuckle at that, before looking back behind her at the massive expanse of forest, and remembering that her team had only 2 days left in their exam. She shuddered slightly thinking about the talking to she'd be getting from the resident Hyuga of their team. It certainly didn't help that she'd not shown up to their rendezvous point, and she had a feeling that Niji wasn't going to be taking Orochimaru showed up as an excuse. Which feels kind of unfair, she thought glumly, given that he did show up. Well, alright guys, I'm off. She gave them a mock salute, which they returned, laughing amongst themselves as best they could. I hope to see you in the next round. Despite everything, she couldn't help but smile at the team in front of her. They might have technically been enemies, but she silently prayed that their teams wouldn't face each other in the coming rounds. We'll be there. Naruto held his hand out to her, giving her a confident thumbs up. You'd better watch yourself, Tenten. Team 7's coming for the championship. It's not really a oh forget it. Sakura sighed, massaging her temples with one hand, and waving goodbye to her with the other. She returned the gesture, and, no more than a second later, jumped into the woods beyond, rushing into the forest's depths. It was a while later before Naruto and the rest of his team were up and moving, and they were being just a bit too slow. Oi, you two! When Sakura and Sasuke turned to look at him, both of their faces a dusty pink with embarrassment, Naruto couldn't help but growl under his breath. This was funny at first, but you two dancing around each other for the last day and a half is starting to get annoying as hell. Naruto pointed back at them, his fingers shaking with rage. Just talk to each other or something. His teammates gaped at him like fish, opening and closing their mouths as they tried to find any retort to his words. Neither of them could, it seemed, as they turned towards one another, not quite meeting each other's gazes. Would you mind if we stopped for a while? Sakura spoke up quietly, her eyes darting around the forest floor in a vain attempt to avoid her current predicament. Naruto's eyes narrowed, but he couldn't help but sigh a second later. You have 15 minutes. So, The girl in front of him coughed awkwardly, and Sasuke himself couldn't help the abject mortification that played upon his face. Honestly, he thought he had it pretty bad, but the Uchiha couldn't quite imagine what it must have been like for the girl before him, having revealed her thoughts without meaning to. I'm sorry, I've never been very good at talking. Sasuke rubbed the back of his neck with his left hand, suddenly feeling rather hot. Do you even want to talk about this? Sakura looked up at him with a flat expression. Do I look like I want to talk about it? Not particularly, no. You're correct. The girl sighed loudly, pursing her lips. And yet if one of us doesn't start talking, we won't get anywhere. Why, yeah. Right. There was another moment of silence, accompanied only by a far-off bug, who seemed determined to try and drown out the silence of the woods with its call. It was a minute or so of that later that Sasuke realized neither of them had even tried to talk. You too. Naruto's voice called from beyond the clearing, sounding more than a little irate. 5 minutes. He could tell, as he looked back towards Sakura's beet red face, that neither of them was going to say anything at all right now. He himself had no idea what he was supposed to say to the girl. What should I say? I mean, she confessed to me, right? Sasuke's thoughts swam in his head, trying desperately to form some kind of solution. But if I don't feel the same way, or do I? I don't even know. Hey, Sasuke? He looked up at the girl before him, who, for the first time since they'd begun speaking, was looking him straight in the eye. I have an idea. And well, I'm not sure if it's the best idea, Sakura admitted, folding her hands just in front of her, and running her thumbs in a circle nervously. But I know I can't exactly own up to how I feel right now. So, I'd like to make you a promise. Huh? After the Chunin exams are over, and once this whole... She rubbed her neck with her hand, right over the spot where Orochimaru's mark lay hidden. Seal thing gets figured out then. I'd like to talk about all of this, okay? Sasuke couldn't help but chuckle a bit as he heard it, causing the girl before him to look up with a small bit of embarrassment. What? Nothing, it's just... A small smile blossomed onto his face, and he couldn't help the pride in his breast either. You seemed really mature there. The girl blinked once before her face exploded in color, and he couldn't help but chuckle when she turned her back to him, more than a little embarrassed. Well, anyways, we should be getting back. He could just barely see a smile peeking out from behind her hair. Wouldn't want that blonde idiot to worry, would we? I suppose we wouldn't. Sasuke smiled back. In the time it took the two of them to walk back, they discussed what their plans were for the rest of the exam, how they felt about some of the other Leaf teams, and about the variety of bugs they'd encountered thus far. I can safely say that even if I never see another centipede in my life, Sakura spoke, eyes hard, it will still be too soon. I feel that on a spiritual level. As they passed through the last couple trees to enter the clearing Naruto sat in, Sasuke couldn't help but feel that the boy was being oddly quiet. Hey guys. Naruto spoke up, waving his hand to the both of them. Hey Naruto. Sakura spoke, waving her hand back, and sitting down next to the boy. What you been up to while we were away? Nothing really, just watching the perimeter. The boy smiled up at him, but he couldn't help but feel that it was a bit sedated. It didn't remind him of a sunny day, not like it usually did. Sakura's eyes narrowed, and she gave him a nod from behind the boy. Yeah, sorry about leaving you over here. I just wanted to talk to Sasuke about our plan for getting to the tower, seeing as how we have both scrolls, and since you're our strongest fighter, I figured you were the best to stay here. Don't worry about it. The boy beside them both waved his hand, trying to brush their concerns away. I get it. It's not a problem. Sasuke smiled himself, standing up and drawing his bag onto his back. Well, we don't have too long before the sun starts to set, shall we be heading out? I suppose we should. Naruto spoke up, slinging his own bag on and walking to stand next to him. Oh, hey, Naruto? The boy looked over at him, a curious expression on his face. Yeah, man? The boy's eyes widened as Sasuke brought a kunai against his neck, not quite biting into it, but enough to threaten more. Sakura's own weapon dug into the boy's spine from behind, keeping him still. Mind telling us who you really are? He spoke coldly, Sharingan spinning into place. And what you've done with our teammate. The boy before them gave a harsh laugh at that, which seemed to echo endlessly among the trees above them. How'd you figure me out? The real Naruto would have known what we were really talking about, Sakura spoke calmly. And he would have known we only had a single scroll. And he would have freaked out if we called him our strongest fighter. Sasuke snickered. Humph, how amusing. The imposter spoke, smiling in a decidedly not Naruto kind of way. A second later, mist exploded out from the boy's body. Sasuke jumped backwards, making distance in case of a surprise attack. His Sharingan could see through any genjutsu, but it appeared that the fog that now blanketed the area around them was real. Sakura! I'm here! The mist cleared after another moment or so, and he waved his teammate forward, standing back to back with her in the center of the clearing. Hee hee, a voice echoed along the tree line above them. They seem to think they can take us, don't they, boys? Hee hee, how lucky! Very lucky! Two masked ninja landed in front of Sasuke, and from the way Sakura tensed behind him, he imagined another was facing her down as well. Those in front of him were dressed, oddly would be a nice way to put it. They wore cream-colored onesies, which was a clothing choice he felt he just couldn't agree with, and they each both had headbands that indicated they were from the Rain Village. One had a patch of cloth on his face that left his left eye uncovered, and the other just wore a blindfold. Can he just not see? Honestly, I don't even want to know at this point. Both of them wore the same mask, and judging by the voice of the man on Sakura's side, it seemed he was wearing one as well. Well then, we'll ask once just to be nice. The ninja on his teammate's side, who was also apparently this team's leader, spoke up. Hand over your scroll, unless you all want to bite it. A snicker came from behind him, and he felt Sakura relax slightly. Alright, I've got this one, Sasuke, you think you can take those too? Pfft, he couldn't help but laugh at the girl's question. Do you need to ask? Not really, the girl admitted. I just wanted to give them a chance to repent. Yeah, that's what I figured. Not gonna come quietly, UI. The masked leader spoke up, drawing a kunai out from his pouch. Fine then, boys, got 'em. They don't seem to be repenting. Sasuke spoke as the two ninja facing him charged forwards, their kunai drawn in front of them. No. They most certainly do not. Well, keep one conscious, we do need to know where Naruto is. Got it. They dashed to meet their opponents. What the hell? The last conscious Rain ninja just managed to push himself off the ground, staring into their faces in disbelief. Why are you brats so strong? Do you want to take that? Sasuke spoke from beside her. Or should I? Sakura pondered for a few moments what she'd even say, and came up with a fat wad of nothing. I don't have anything. Just tell us where our teammate is so we can knock you out. You're not going to let me answer his question? Sasuke actually sounded a bit hurt. I don't really feel like letting this take a long time, if I'm being honest. Fine. Sasuke sighed disappointedly, before looking down at the boy below them. Well, you heard her, where's our teammate? I'll never tell you. A shuriken impacted the space directly next to the ninja's face. He's about 20 meters that way, the boy pointed to his right, his fingers shaking. Tied to a tree about 10 meters off the ground. Alright, as a last bit of humiliation, Sakura reached down and took the heaven scroll off of their opponent. Thanks for your help. Sakura turned towards the forest as she heard Sasuke knock the Amigekure ninja unconscious, taking a few long strides into it. It only took a moment to start hearing the muffled yelling. Quiet down, Naruto, I'll be there in a second. She heard the boy yell something back that may very well have been a response, but it was lost in whatever material was covering his mouth. When she finally made her way up to the boy, and pulled the makeshift gag off him, Naruto had the nerve to look annoyed with her. Took you guys long enough. Naruto, it took us maybe 5 minutes. The boy grumbled something under his breath, which Sakura thought sounded vaguely like wouldn't have taken me that long, but she decided not to call the boy out on it. Alright, well, on the bright side, Sakura raised the heaven scroll she'd looted from the Rain ninja. We've got both scrolls now. I guess that's a bright side, Naruto admitted with a pout. She could tell the boy felt just a little left out, first with her and Sasuke talking to each other, and then missing the fight. She could empathize with that, though, she'd felt like that for far too long. It was only nowadays that she felt strong enough to stand beside the two of them, and every time she caught up, it seemed like they threatened to leave her behind yet again. She patted the boy on the back and held her hand out to him. "Come on, no pouting," she smiled playfully. "You'll get the chance to prove how strong you are in a day or two." Naruto looked up at her, still pouting, but nodded, at least acknowledging her point. He took her hand a second later, letting her pull him up, and stood just beside her. "Where's Sasuke?" said boy jumped up on their branch to stand beside them. "Sorry, I was knocking out that guy from the ring." "Oh, okay." Naruto seemed to think about that for a second. "Does anyone else think it's weird that this is an entirely normal conversation we're having? Like, oh, someone tried to kill us again, no biggie." They all laughed at that, though Sakura could definitely see where the boy was coming from with that one. It was a bit odd that they were suddenly so used to it, but they'd been assaulted by people trying to kill them 3 times in the last 5 days. It was a bit hard for the concept to still be novel. It helped that their most recent assailants were the weakest they'd faced so far. At this point, it'd probably be best to make our way to the central tower. Sasuke spoke confidently, smiling over at the two of them. "Should we go now, or maybe rest for a bit? We were just in a fight." Sakura weighed the options in her head. "I'm not all that tired, you?" "I'm fine to go on," Sasuke responded, turning to the third member of their team. "Naruto?" "I'm good to go." "Alright then." Sasuke looked upwards, towards where the tree line parted just enough for them to see the central tower. "Shall we head out then?" Sakura smiled, as did Naruto beside her. "Yeah. Well, this place is surprisingly big." The 3 members of Team 7 were standing in a decently sized corridor, with 2 railed walkways just above them on both sides. The room was painted a neutral green color, and there was a scroll on the back wall. On it was a poem. "Open the series of heaven and earth." "Sasuke!" Naruto shouted out, pointing at his friend. "I totally get what this says, but I don't think you do. Explain it." The Uchiha gave him a flat look. "Why are you like this?" The Jinchuriki coughed into his fist. "Anyways, just make it make sense. I think it just wants us to open our heaven and earth scrolls, right?" Sakura spoke up, sounding pretty sure of herself. "Yeah, I assume so." Sasuke brought the scrolls out, throwing one over to him. "We'll open them at the same time, okay?" "Gotcha." He nodded back, placing his thumb just underneath the scroll's seal. After they'd finished opening the scrolls, there was an explosion of white smoke, from out of which not one, but 2 familiar figures rose to meet them. "Hello, Naruto, everyone." "Yo, you damned kids." Zabuza Momochi and Iruka Yumino stepped out of the smoke, looking murderous and proud, respectively. "You brats, took 5 whole days to complete this test." Zabuza walked over to them, getting right in their faces. Well, Iruka spoke, seeming a bit frightened. "I'm proud of you all. You've done very well. If I still had a sword, I'd use it to skin your sorry hides. I think your performance was exemplary. Once you've finished here, you can head upstairs to rest for tomorrow's battles. Look at you all, beat to shit in some kiddie exam. I'm getting whiplash," he whispered to Sasuke. "Yeah, tell me about it. I'm pretty sure this is an interrogation technique." "Good cop, bad cop?" Sasuke snickered beside him. "Yeah." He chuckled under his breath. "Are you two whispering?" They shot up, going ramrod straight. "And no, sir." "Definitely not, sir." As they handed Kin off to the medical team, Zaku couldn't help the feeling of wanting to go with her, just to be sure she'd be alright. He didn't, however, because he knew doing that would be putting them all at risk. They were escorted through several rooms in the tower, eventually ending up in front of a small, almost hotel-like room. "You'll be staying here until tomorrow's fights," their escort told them, looking completely and utterly bored. "Don't leave the room unless there's an emergency. Do not damage any of the items in the room. Do not try and go to the exam site on your own. We will come to escort you." As the man brought them inside and stepped back out, he wished them luck. Sitting down on his tiny bed, Zaku couldn't help but think the thing had seen better days. Alright, so, step 1 complete, I guess. Yeah. His teammate replied quickly, taking his gauntlet off and setting it on the table beside him. The boy had just begun to unwrap the bindings around his face when Zaku spoke up. What do we do now? Win, Dosa said simply. Because it's all that we can do. It was harsh, but it was true. The reality of their situation was that they could, and probably would, be discarded. Really, it was at their master's leisure. They weren't important pieces of his plan, just a single part. Just pawns. There was a ringing in Zaku's ears as he thought that. A small, tiny voice seemed to cry out in the back of his head. Hey Zaku? Can you promise me something? Anything. Get out of this place. Get out of here and live your life how you want to. Don't let anyone else tell you how to live it. Zaku snapped back to reality, massaging his temples to try and get rid of the lingering pain that rang in his skull. That same memory again. You alright? He looked up at Dosu, who was staring right at him. Why yeah, just some old memories I've been trying to ignore. Humph. Dosu finished unwrapping his face, and set his headband on the table as well. Get some rest, you'll need it. The exams start up as soon as the sun rises. Yeah. I know. He laid back against the wall behind him, trying not to think about that memory. It wasn't fading like the last one, but seemed to be something he'd recovered for good. Even still, it was only a piece. He could tell, because every second it seemed he was this close to hearing more of it, to figuring out who was who and what was what, but it eluded him. He didn't want to think about it, and so of course he did. It was all he could think about. The thoughts of that voice, that boy's voice, and his own, warred in his head for an hour, 2 hours, and longer still into the night. And when morning came, he hadn't slept a wink. Enko sat quietly in the camera room, doing her best not to gnaw her fingernails off as she waited as patiently as possible for any information to surface. It was going poorly. Damn it, those kids Jiraiya was watching our back, so where the hell is he? One of the Umbu watching the cameras with her flinched, looking up at her sheepishly. I'm sure he was just held up with something, ma'am. Well, he's still goddamn slow. Enko's teeth ground together as she thought about that man getting up to any more madness while no one was watching him. Gods, I can see why the third Hokage had mixed feelings about bringing him on. Good to know I'm appreciated. She turned to see the man she'd been looking for standing in the doorway, covered in leaves, and looking more than a little annoyed. Ah. Good you're here. Enko walked over to him, a flash of anger in her gaze. Those kids didn't see you? Jiraiya seemed mildly offended. They were genin. I'm a world-renowned infiltration expert. If they spotted me, I'd have killed myself on the spot. Well, that's good at least. What do you mean at least? I'm going to ignore that. What about Orochimaru? Did he try and attack them again? He didn't, though I suspect that's because I was there, and even then, some of his cronies still did. Jiraiya looked over at the cameras, pointing to one that focused on a room that held 2 boys, both from the Sound Village. These guys work for Orochimaru, apparently. Enko rose immediately, bringing a kunai into her left hand. Whoa, the white maned giant put a hand on her shoulder, stopping her in her tracks. Where are off to? Are you kidding? Her anger flared once more, and she felt the telltale pain of her curse marks swelling onto her neck. I'm going to go subdue those brats and haul them in for interrogation. Don't be rash. Enko couldn't hide the surprise on her face as the man yelled at her. The giant took one of the chairs set up in front of the cameras, drew it behind him, and sat down. What do we gain by capturing those 2? Are you seriously asking that? She was furious now. This man was supposed to be one of Konoha's greatest, and he was questioning her on something as dull as this? We get information on his plans, what he's here for, we could. And why would they have that information? Her stunned silence seemed to be enough for the man, because he continued talking a moment later. You didn't get to see them fight, those kids over there, did you? He pointed towards the screen. They're low Chunin level opponents, small fry. There's no way they'd be given any more of the plan than was immediately relevant to them. I didn't consider that. And that's not your fault. Orochimaru's got us all on edge. Jiraiya sighed, drawing out a small bottle from his coat and taking a drink of it. I'd imagine facing down anyone else, you'd have figured all of that out on your own. I get it, believe me, I do, but unless we're careful about this, we lose one of our only sources of information about Orochimaru. Now that she didn't get. How are they sources of information like this? Well, we know that they're working for Orochimaru, right? Enko nodded to show she was following. And they're only here for the exams. Therefore, we can assume anyone they interact with in the village is, themselves, an agent of Orochimaru. When the man laid it out like that, Enko couldn't help but nod in agreement. The plan made sense. What I'm proposing is simple. I'll follow those two, or, I guess 3, since the third is in one of the medical wings here, and see what I can find out. Wouldn't it be easy for Orochimaru to find you? Can't he recognize your chakra or something? He could, that is true, but at the same time, he'd be able to find someone less adept than me in much less time than it'd take for him to find someone of my caliber. Jiraiya gave a what can you do kind of gesture. I'm still the best candidate, even with Orochimaru knowing me and my habits like the back of his hand. That annoyed Anko a little. If she was being honest, she still wanted to be involved in this case in some way. I'd like to do something myself, though, she admitted a second later, deciding it was better to just come out and ask. What can I do? Jiraiya ran his hand along his chin, seeming a bit hard-pressed to come up with something. A while later, something seemed to dawn on him, and he smiled down at her. Actually, there is something you could do. Jiraiya stood, walking to stand just beside her. Can I see the mark on your neck, just for a second? There was a momentary pause as Anko considered that. I swear if you try anything. Yeah, even I'm not dumb enough to do that. Jiraiya stepped to stand behind her, moving her hair so that he could get a good look at her neck. It takes a second to manifest, give me a moment. She thought of her darkest times, of her greatest failures, of Orochimaru getting away with all of this, and felt the telltale pain of the curse mark whirl to life on her neck. So it is the same. What are you talking about? Earlier, when Orochimaru attacked those kids, I think he was trying to give one of them a curse mark. That got a reaction out of her, and Anko was suddenly out of her seat, anger flowing freely across her face. Did he do it? Unfortunately, I think he did. I watched the battle between Team 7 and those Sound Ninja, and one of the members had a mark just like this one on their necks. So he was after someone? Is it possible that's the only reason he's here at all? No, he wouldn't go this far just to corrupt one kid. He's just figured he can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Jiraiya sounded grim as he rubbed his chin, seemingly deep in thought. At least, that's what I assume, but it's possible that he's using all of this as a cover for some even grander scheme. You just don't think it's that? She asked as she fixed her hair, bringing it back down over her curse mark, and letting the thing fade as her anger did, replaced instead by curiosity. Yeah, I think this is, not the endgame, but his magnum opus, if you catch my meaning. This is what he's been planning for, all these years. Jiraiya sounded oddly confident, and Anko realized with a small bit of sadness that the man had likely been chasing his old friend for decades now, hoping to find out what he really wanted. Personally, I wish he'd get on with it. I much prefer fighting to strategizing. Anko laughed. Same here, I'm not so much of a thinker either. Her laughter died down after a few seconds, and she felt some small tension occupy the room. So, what is it you'd have me do? So, Team 7, on one team, there's the last Uchiha, the Nine-Tails Jinchuriki. Jiraiya looked down at her, a small smile on his face. And some random girl. Okay, so? Well, some random girl just so happens to be the recipient of a little gift from our friend Orochimaru. What? Why would he give her a curse mark? According to what I could overhear from those 3, it was a mistake. The curse mark was meant for Sasuke Uchiha, though even still, I don't know why. He looked over to her, sporting an odd grin. But that doesn't matter. What does matter is that I know what you can do to help. Oh? Anko could tell, now, that this wasn't going to be particularly fun for her. And what would that be? He pointed to the camera feed, where the 3 members of Team 7 were idly conversing in a small room. More specifically, he was pointing at a pink-haired girl. I want you to train her.